I have seen a man who wanted to make a wallet out of a woman's skin. So he killed her boyfriend in a sort of, when they were going for a walk along a towpath, and then he killed her to skin her. A lot of my early life was sort of in just outside Sheffield in northeast Derbyshire, where I was brought up. Later I was at school in Sheffield and then went to boarding school in South Derbyshire. I'm sure you're going to ask me why I did psychiatry, and I actually think that boarding school was very important and as a matter of psychological survival. And at that time, there have been various articles in newspapers about the terrible times that some people had at private boarding schools. And the one I went to was a bit grim. One of the ways to survive physically is a good way to survive, and you had to be able to fight. But the other was actually to learn people's weaknesses and defend yourself against larger and more bullying people than yourself by knowing what their weaknesses were. So you became somebody who they would keep at arm's length.
So that was sort of a training for your later work?
I think it was. I was very good at sort of arts subjects. I was very good at English literature, is what I really... And my mother persuaded me that I should become a doctor, which I really was not cut out to be at all, if I'm honest. But during medical school, I became increasingly interested in psychiatry. And I just found I just seemed to have a natural sort of affiliation, and ended up in my final year, after sort of quite a grim academic pedigree of sort of having to do resits for 3 years out of my 5, I suddenly won the medical school prize, gold prize in psychiatry. And it just sort of really fitted me, and it fitted my thinking. I just started my career, and I was told to report to Brixton Prison. I'm sitting in a room with the consultant, and I've read in the newspaper, I heard about it first on the radio, then I read it in the newspaper, that a woman had been found murdered, had bled to death. There was blood all over the flat, and her toddler was found sitting in a high chair, crying. And the police had got him very quickly, and he was very quickly remanded into custody. And I sat and listened to, I'd never heard anything like this before. There's almost this monotonous sort of Cockney voice describing how he had stabbed her. He was jabbing her repeatedly at a knife. He'd burst his way into her house, held a knife to her, and forced her to go round her house at knife point, whilst he forced her to find any valuables. He hardly got anything at all. She didn't have many, but he kept on stabbing her, and she had bled to death because he locked her in a cupboard, basically. It was the description of what he'd actually done, and the sort of almost mindlessness of it, that it didn't really make a lot of sense. So he just wanted any money he could get. He abused mainly alcohol, some drugs. He just wanted some money to pay for his rent, and he didn't have any really great concerns about it. And I was sort of left after I'd gotten over it. I was actually fascinated. I was essentially I was hooked on the whole thing. This is what I decided I really wanted to do and see more of in the future, to understand why.
That's really interesting, because I'm sure a lot of people would have wanted to, I suppose, run in the other direction after an experience like that. Why do you think you were fascinated by it?
I don't know. Well, I think it took me years to realise the obvious. It's my father. My father was from Northern Ireland, and he left Northern Ireland. It didn't look like he had a future. He was from a large family, and the elder boys got college educations, and he had a dead-end job, so he did what many Irish immigrants do. He joined the Irish Guards and later the police force. And he had a terrible war, And it wasn't till now I look back and realise he had PTSD. He'd been a prisoner of war for 5 years. He was captured, and his entire battalion were killed or captured fighting a rearguard at Dunkirk. And he was sort of old school, basically. So I realised that it must be something to do with that, the containment of potentially very dangerous people. Plus detective work. He wasn't a detective, but there is that element of sort of tracking down and so I think there must be that within me, that shaped my interest in forensic psychiatry.
How did you come to meet Ian Brady, and why were you interested in meeting him?
I went to see him at the request of a solicitor to prepare a report on him, and it was a remarkable experience in the sense, the key thing about him, I mean, he would not tell me, and he has never disclosed exactly why he did it. And of course, I did try and get him to explain why, and he just brushed me off in what was a really fascinating interview, in the sense that I realised when I saw him, it was like going to see a rather scruffy Oxford Don. He was in a sort of a sports jacket and flannels, and he had this shock of hair, and he was essentially in control. It was a battle of control, where he was not basically, which I lost, in the sense that he had to dictate how the interview was going. It's a remarkable sort of experience that and what he would talk about. I could, at various intervals, ask a few questions I wanted to ask, but mainly he spent most of his time ranting about the staff of the hospital he was in. For me, the key thing about it was, by that time I've had quite a lot of experience, was how negative I felt towards him, how much and it is absolutely crucial, I think, in all areas of psychiatry, but particularly forensic psychiatry, is to be aware of your feelings about, am I afraid? Do I like the person? And why do I feel these waves of hatred coming over me? It's what's called in psychodynamics, it's called countertransference. And this is the idea that the individual, the patient, produces in you particular feelings, and that they sort of project them into you because it's somehow coming from them. But it also is something to do with your sort of life experiences and your background and what you've seen before. Clearly, he was a psychopath. He was a sadist. I don't know. I'm sure that he would have got sexual gratification from the nature of one or two of his victims. I suspect that his main thing was actually he had. It seemed to me there had been huge arguments for years between psychiatrists as to whether he was psychotic or not. I thought he was mentally ill, actually, when I reflected on it, and it seemed as if he was. It's not in the textbooks any longer. It was like it was megalomania, and actually this was somebody who was almost perceived himself as godlike. It was beyond sort of narcissism. It was almost as if he had a sort of godlike feeling, and so he was entitled to murder children. But it was still something more than just that. So you're not going to nobody's going to particularly like somebody who's committed offences like that. But there was more than that. There's something that he produced in me in terms of my reaction to him, which was quite profoundly different, which contrasts with Peter Sutcliffe. I was training. When I first started my more heavy-duty training as a specialist registrar, the grade before consultant, and I was sort of at a fairly early stage in Broadmoor. And who should, is thinking, oh, my goodness me, I'm on call. I've got to, any new cases or anybody, emergencies, I've got to go, dash the other side of the hospital and see them. And on this occasion, I'm thinking, wow. And so I interviewed him, and he had all the symptoms of schizophrenia, and I managed to find a couple more. But I still felt this is the strain. He doesn't feel like he's got schizophrenia at all. And he behaves absolutely normally. And I found him a polite, pleasant Yorkshireman who you might find leading up against a pub in Leeds somewhere. Affable, polite, and absolutely, I didn't have any reaction. Obviously I knew what he'd done, and he told me that he'd been that he did this for God, and he told me about how God was controlling his hands on the steering wheel when he was driving to commit the offences. But as a person, as I say, there's the lack of any negative. That was interesting in itself.
What's your approach? How do you begin those interviews and conversations with people who've committed crimes like murder?
Different people do different things. And I think that I've developed a particular style over time. But I mean, basically, I feel I'm very much there to, if it's a serious offence, I want to know about their motivation. I mean, why did they do it? What was the motive? Talk them through it. So what happened? And so hear what they have to say. And then you might sort of start chatting. But there was a witness said that actually that you had brought that knife from home when you stabbed her. You just mean that's and see how they respond to that, and sort of build up a picture, and then go into all the other things about them, their family, their history, their experiences. You really always need to have their criminal history. Have they got previous convictions? And their general mental state. A lot of the cases you get referred to as a forensic psychiatrist are patients with schizophrenia, actually. I mean, that's typically what most of the cases that you're being referred, serious cases you get to see. And actually, some of the people with no mental abnormality are much more difficult and more challenging to work out. The other group, which I used to see a lot of, were individuals with severe personality disorder. Very, very unusual cases. And they are very difficult and challenging.
And when you say personality disorders, are you talking about things like psychopathy, or would that fall
under
that?
Psychopathy, you tend not to admit, unless by accident, it's often get into hospital, because they are so difficult. And so it's not going to sort of necessarily break up the place and attack people, but actually they start manipulating one group of staff against the other. They start making formal complaints, instructing their lawyers against it. It goes on and on and on. They start suddenly making an accusation against the psychologist that she's been trying to seduce them. They were extremely disruptive. And they, in terms of sort of getting through their sort of various psychological defenses, it's probably impossible. And there's a whole issue about, I would say, from having assessed many psychopaths, so you had a research interest in psychopaths, is that you are dealing with somebody who isn't wired up properly, that they do not function like other people. Seeing a case where a man, he'd been homeless for quite a while, and for no apparent reason was in a sort of derelict warehouse, sleeping with some poor other homeless person who, as far as we could see, the evidence seemed to suggest, had been kind to him and given him some food. And they'd shared some alcohol, and for no reason at all that one could tell, he'd put a door that was off its hinges on top of him and stamped him to death in the middle of the night. And he had given various explanations, that the man had attacked him, that the man had stolen from him, that they were both drunk and got into a fight. There was no evidence that this man had been aggressive to him or even properly defended himself. But it was the experience while I was talking to him trying to get him to explain this, in which he suddenly, it's very disconcerting, he suddenly started talking to me as if, and I didn't know whether this was a fantasy, whether he was making it up on the spot, whether it was true, whether he thought he seemed to be addressing me as the victim. And he started saying, well, yes, you're aggressive, weren't you? And this is the way we treat people like you, and this is what we do to people like you. I'm thinking, is he going to come over the table at me? What's he doing here? It's like he's lost all sense of reality. Is he trying to intimidate me? Is he trying to con me? Is he trying to... What is he doing? Why do this? And so otherwise he was a sort of very big man, dull, not very intelligent. I've been a petty criminal throughout his life, actually. And then had done this horrible murder for no apparent reason. But he was basically a psychopath. I mean, he would sort of con people, exploit them in various ways, but nothing like this, and for no particular reason.
I suppose in your experience of interviewing people who have committed murder, how often do you find that the killers have a sense of, I suppose, remorse or feel sorry for the crime they've committed versus those that actually maybe take some enjoyment from the murder?
There seem to be a group of, two groups of individuals. There's an overlap. And those who find, it's the act of killing, okay? They're mainly driven by a desire to kill. There's those who find it sexually exciting, and those who, I was about to say just, who find it exciting without the sexual element. There's a small number of cases that can go between the two, but actually they tend to generally be and so the ones that are sexually excited are those who the crime is committed. It's driven by primarily sexual gratification. But what you actually find in most of these cases, and so that will typically, but not always, include the serial killers that you find very interesting. Most people find them interesting. But, they often have obsessional thinking. The thoughts keep on coming back into their mind. It's a bit like OCD, but it's not quite the same, because most people with OCD are distressed by the thoughts, and these individuals sometimes are distressed by the thoughts keep coming back to them, but mostly they enjoy the thoughts, and there's a sense of compulsion. They've got to do it. I mean, I have seen a man who wanted to make a wallet out of a woman's skin, so he killed her boyfriend in a sort of when they were going for a walk in along a towpath, and then he killed her to skin her. So it's actually for a fetishistic object that he wanted. So her death was obviously inevitable, but that's what he wanted. And that actually he was remorseful afterwards, surprisingly.
I wanted to know, as a forensic psychiatrist, whether you believe that people are evil.
There's two things here to say. So evil. Evil, it's not in my textbook. It's not in any of my research papers. Evil is a religious concept. And so it's not something, there is, I mean, an old friend of mine and colleague who wrote a score of how evil a group of serial killers. He hadn't actually interviewed them. He'd actually got them from books and papers. So I think it was actually how unpleasant, things like somebody who tortured somebody to death would be at the sort of the top over hours before they were allowed to die, might be sort of number one evil. But that's not really, that's something else. Do I think some cases should never be released? Yes, I do. I don't think they should be released. And I've seen quite a number of cases who would do it again at the first opportunity, despite what they have said in terms of denial. And what they've done is so bad that they should never be released.
I suppose throughout your career, you've dealt with some of the darkest depths of humanity and the most awful crimes.
Yes.
How do you deal with those dark subject matter? I mean, does it affect you?
I'll give you the truthful answer. It doesn't affect me. When I first started, I was affected. And I tell you what, it helps if you have been in therapy yourself. I think this happens when you're inexperienced and you don't know what's happening to you. You don't know the power of the patient. So I think that in the early stage, you need supervision. I'd sometimes try and think about like a pathologist who does dissection. I really wouldn't want to do that. But actually, that's just what I'm doing. That's exactly what I'm doing in a psychiatric sense. It's like a post-mortem. And it's the patient's mind. It is very much like that. Some people can actually be a casualty of it. So I think it is possible. I think it's very important. And some people really are not cut out to do it.
In this case, there was pots and pans on the top of the cooker, and you kind of think to yourself, they just haven't done their washing up. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. But then when you looked at the material in the frying pan, it was like, wow, that doesn't look like normal food, you know. And anyway, it turned out that, yeah, it was brain.